All right, we can get started now, and as people join, that's fine. So I want to start by thanking Miss Johnson for taking time out of her busy schedule to come join us, and I want to thank all of the attendants for also coming to listen. And with that, I'll pass it over. Also, if you have any questions, please put it in the Q&A part, and we'll get to them at the end. Thank you.
All right. Hi, everybody. Virtual things are always so interesting because I can never see your beautiful faces, but thank you so much for joining us this Saturday. My name is Dominique Johnson. I'm going to share my screen so that I can walk you through a presentation and then take questions at the end. So I'm sharing my screen now. Okay, perfect. All right, so my name is Dominique Johnson, and I am the Senior Director of Community Engagement here at the Center for Policing Equity. I also do social impact and partnerships work, and when you think of CPE, many of you are thinking about the intersections that we have with law enforcement and policing, but we're in the and phase as well. So anything that is in the and, which I'll explain further along in the presentation, is sort of what I do here as Senior Director. So this is my bio. I just wanted to share that, but it's on the website if you guys want to take an actual look and deep dive into it. At CPE, what do? We're working directly with police to measure behaviors and revise policies that result in fewer people killed and fewer people in jail. And we like to call that data science for justice. Our 5 audiences are community, law enforcement, donors, policymakers, and our science community. So one of the things that's really important for folks to understand is that when folks think about CPE, they are assuming that we are coming in as a place where we invite ourselves. We don't. So police departments invite us in. So we'll talk to a chief. A chief will say, hey, I'm really interested in thinking about the ways in which my department could do better. So they're proactively seeking us out. They're part of the National Justice Database. So the Justice Database is the nation's first database tracking national statistics on policing, including stops, use of force, and standardizing data collection across many of the police departments. So the goal of the NJD is to equip law enforcement to do their job safely, pinpoint instances of poor police behavior, and empower communities to trust their public safety nationwide. So we're sort of like vampires. We're invited in to do our mischief. The departments say, hey, we have some disparities, or we think we do, or we just want to be better at what we do. Our data folks connect with their data folks. We do an analysis of traffic stops, pedestrian stops, and use of force. And then we collect a report that has a list of recommendations of all the ways in which departments are responsible for the work that they do and how they are interacting with their communities. Sometimes there are really great things in these reports. And then sometimes there are racial disparities that cannot be accounted for than any other way of the policies that are in place in those departments. And so those departments will then say, what are we supposed to do? How do we fix these things? And we work with them to think about the ways in which they have agency to make changes in their departments based upon those recommendations, and then listening to the community around things like mental health, homelessness, thinking about the ways in which people are over-policed for poverty. And we work with communities and law enforcement to get to the root of the causes and make sure that our council folks know that these are the things that the police department can actively change, and this is how they're going to do it. And then working with those agencies to figure out who else can help fix some of these problems that are contributing to burdensome policing and high racial disparities. So we are now moving into a phase where we're providing that actual service. When we give a report, it's usually just recommendations, and the chief can say, hey, thank you for these recommendations, really great. We're gonna handle it internally and we don't need any help. Or they can now sign up for what we call CompStat for Justice, or what we call at CPE, C4J. Traditionally, CompStat was used in police departments around the world to track and reduce crime. Many people have heard the term CompStat from the NYPD. That's sort of where it originated. And at CPE, we're using the same process to hold departments accountable and promote more equitable policing practices. And so the process is we collect the data, we analyze the data, we make the data public, and then we use that data to drive decisions about policy practices and procedures. And so how this relates to the community is that they're involved in every step of this process. So when the departments say, hey, we are ready to take these recommendations and implement them, we say, we're here, we're ready. And we help them to create an on-site team made up of interested community members, members of policymakers, different department, law enforcement staff, and other interested stakeholders who are working to reduce the policing footprint in their communities and make their communities more equitable and safer. So when you think about this piece, this is the beginning of what people are asking for when they're trying to move into reimagining public safety. This section of it would be known sort of as harm reduction, where we are trying to assess risks and figure out who owns what in the disparities and how we can make those disparities, how we can shrink those disparities as we're moving the work forward to think about where else in public safety are people facing burdensome policies and practices. So for that work, you sort of really rely on community engagement. At CPE, we're giving communities the tools to empower themselves and do the work to affect change. And we're doing that through thought partnership, direct outreach, and social impact and partnerships work. So when communities are now coming to us post the murder of George Floyd, communities are stepping up and saying, hey, we want to take back our communities. We need to reallocate, reimagine, and think about divesting and investing. Can you help us? And so that could be just one person who calls us and says, I want to make a change. How do I do it? That can be groups that are saying, we're task force designed to do this, but we don't know where to begin. Or that could be different public safety agencies saying, hey, we need help. And so they've been coming to us lately, and they do not want to take a look directly at the policing side of things. It's a part of it, but they also want to look at where are the rest of our funds going and how do we move forward. And so what I do and what my team does is we help them into thinking about who owns what are the disparities, what services are being provided in the communities as they are right now. Thinking about who needs to be involved in this process, because policing is only a core of the public safety agencies that represent communities. And we want to make sure that if you are going to sort of pull responsibilities away from the departments, that you also have standards and agencies that can sort of respond in real time. So for example, if you are trying to advocate for mental health emergency calls to be pulled away from the police departments, they want that too. The problem becomes that what community seems to have issue with is who's going to take those calls. And when you have, everybody's saying social workers take those calls. Well, I just had calls the other day with a large group of social workers in a state that I don't want to name, but they called me and they said, hey, they're saying that we're supposed to take this work over. And we're not sure that we have the capacity to do this, and we don't know sort of what the parameters are or how things are going to go, but the policy that was enacted just said that police are no longer doing this as of this date. And so what we do here at CPE is we help them to figure out, what is your agency? What do you want to actually do? Do you want to be responsible for making sure that people are safe if 911 no longer handles those calls? Who is getting paid to do this work? Because social workers already are not, they're not very staffed. They are underpaid, under-resourced. And so to move such a big population of community needs to their portfolio, it's really detrimental if you don't have a plan of who is going to be actually doing it. How are you going to pay these people? Where's the sustainability to it? And so what we're working with those social workers to do is to help the state come up with a comprehensive plan. So they have put together a task force, and they're working to move their vision of the public safety piece that they have been required to own at this point into a place where it's actually sustainable, actionable, and collaborative with all of the different public safety agencies. So that's just a small example. So we do that all day, every day. And we also are still working with our departments as they are sort of having budget cuts. And so what does that mean for the work that they have to continue to do as their budgets are being cut, as policies are shrinking things and making it more more difficult for them to be able to do their work. So we sort of see ourselves in the middle of a community engagement here as harm reduction workers as well as reimagination folks. So we're in both of those spaces all the time. And what we tell people is that harm reduction is important as you're reimagining the work, because you need to make sure that you have a plan in place. Many people are coming to us with approaches that say, we want to reduce, we want to reallocate, we want to reimagine, and there are no concrete steps to get there that are going to make sure that people are not disproportionately impacted and vulnerable communities do not sort of bear the burden of this difficult process. So I'm going to keep going. I think so. Ooh, I'm so sorry. All right. So one of the ways that we do that is we have a lot of youth voice at CPE. So one of our community engagement assistants has been helping to sort of feel the different buckets of work that we do. So they do a lot of thinking about how do we use evidence-based solutions to make our country more just? And so we're empowering our young people in the same way that we're empowering our communities. We are giving them projects and connecting them with communities to help uplift them, to help uplift communities to do the work. Communities have the answers. They're the closest to the problems, so they're closest to the solutions. And we're just giving them the tools and the confidence that they need to continue in the fight for justice. How can you get involved? CPE has a roadmap for exploring new models of funding for public safety. I have a link here, and it is also on the website. So if you go to our CPE website, it pops right up, it's right in front of your face. You can also start in your own community, thinking about who are the stakeholders in your community, thinking about who you can bring to the table, which community members are involved, are not involved, but should be. Are you going to collaborate with other organizations? And if so, how do you do that? Identifying your goals, your roles, and your timelines are really, really, really crucial. Really thinking about what it is that you want, and then thinking about strategically how to make that happen. And then getting to work, of course. And then you can connect with us on our website, on our Twitter, and definitely on our Facebook. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen because it was a lot of information. And I want to be able to take the time to answer tons of questions. So you let me know how I can be best helpful for you in this process of reimagination. And I'm here to answer those questions.
We got a couple of questions. First one is, someone said, can you talk a little bit more about what specific kinds of data that you collect when you're trying to see in what areas police can improve, and how do you go about collecting and analyzing that data?
Absolutely. So I am not a data person by any means, but we do have a team of very great data acquisition specialists. So when a police department sort of invites us in, our data acquisition specialists work with their records keepers. So one of the things you have to realize about police departments is that their systems are all different, and there's no standardized process of collecting data. So you can have a sheriff's office who comes to us and they have handwritten data, or you can have a large department that comes to us and they have this wonderful system, but they don't record identification in the same way. So in California, for example, race is not something that is sort of put on your license or in any places. And when you're collecting the data, sometimes it'll be unknown because the officer does not want to ask someone to self-identify. The information isn't there if a traffic stop happens. And then when you are collecting that data, you're getting a lot of unknowns for race. So those are some of the different nuances as you're collecting data. But what CPE does is we specifically look for use of force, traffic stops, and pedestrian stops. Those are sort of been what we find are the most crucial in looking at burdensome policing. And so we sort of do regression. I don't, but our wonderful team does regression analysis, and they sort of work through the ways in which you can highlight the disparities in those. And some of those are racial disparities, and then some of them could just be disparities against other things like poverty or other factors that we consider in that index of thinking about a community and their departments.
And so you talked about how you guys make recommendations, how CPE makes recommendations to the department once they've highlighted these problems. Do you know, and what are these types of recommendations that they make? What are some of the different ways you all go about in trying to make these places more equitable?
So because we have MOUs, so those are memorandums of understanding, which means that unless the department says that we're public, we're not allowed to share exactly what those recommendations are. What I can say is that many of the recommendations are around the same things that many people are asking for. You know, thinking about how policing sometimes ties into burdensome criminalization of poverty. So if folks are getting stopped at alarming rates, it is because many of them are in neighborhoods that are underserviced already, and you're finding that a traffic stop or pedestrian stop or use of force is happening in particular neighborhoods. And then in those neighborhoods, what are the parameters or the external factors that are causing people to have to go with a broken tail light? You know, if you have a broken tail light and you're constantly stopped, you probably can't fix the tail light because there are other societal, income factors that are the case. And then that sort of leads you right into the eye of law enforcement, because one of the policies is that departments have to stop folks who have traffic light issues. And so those are sort of small things that we can sort of give recommendations for, but they're much more comprehensive, and they're also really specific to the different departments itself.
One person asked, how much have the recent events, especially the deaths of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, influenced your recommendations and advice?
Every day. I think that people are more open to talking about the work, and they're thinking beyond policing. So I always like to tell my departments when we're working with them that it's about the movement at this point. This has been a historical sort of awakening. We have had 400 years of folks being oppressed, specifically Black folks and Black people like me. And so if you are in a place right now where the movement, you're seeing the possibility to sort of reimagine inequitable systems and demand justice and demand equality and a quality of life, you're going to take it. And right now, the front door is the police departments, because that sort of made the national news. But that doesn't mean that we're not coming for education next. That doesn't mean that we're not coming for the child foster care system. That doesn't mean that we're not coming for other systems that are inequitable. It just means that this is the time right now that policing is in the spotlight. And if we sort of can work with departments and we can work with communities to create the vision that everybody wants to see happen, we have the opportunity to do that for all different systems. And I think that the momentum is there. I think that people are finally realizing that they have the agency and the power to do it. And CPE is really just here to like be cheerleaders and keep them going and help support them in any way that we can.
One person asked, social services and police are both state managed and there are differences. Do you think having them work together to handle domestic or mental health issues will be a difficult task given the difference between states, and how can they be implemented and who will implement them?
Okay, so first I must say it's a really good question. I ask these questions all the time when folks are contacting me and they're saying, you know, we want to do this, but this is what the problems or the barriers are to doing that. I think that social services and police departments can work together. I think that for me, the biggest thing that I've been talking to community about is that all of these systems are inequitable in some way and are burdensome to people of color, and they're burdensome to poor people. And so if you are going to pull the onus of responsibility for social services from police departments, you better make sure that you have a plan that will not just move all of the calls to another inequitable system. And so many people are saying, oh, social workers, this is really great. I always encourage people to think about how many social workers currently are working, you know, and if you are trying to serve a particular community or a particular skill set. So let's say you're looking for Black social workers who deal with post-traumatic stress disorder. I would encourage people to go in their communities and look on their mental health sort of websites or ZocDoc or wherever and see how many of those people are currently providing those services that are Black, who are providing those, what kind of insurance are they taking, what is the plan for sort of moving those spaces over to it? Because you have a lot of people who cannot become social workers because they're not paying enough. So are we giving money then, the money that we're pulling from police departments, are we then giving that to colleges to invite people to take social work school, to go to social work school and get their master's so that then they can come out and become social workers? Then are we paying them a livable wage to do that? Are we also connecting them to services so that they won't burn out? Because that's a very high stress, quick burnout job. So like, what are we doing to ensure a sustainable method for that? And I think that that's going to be challenging because of how people can implement different things in different localities. And I think having a statewide difference and a local difference is going to make a huge, it's going to cause a lot of tensions. And so I want people to just be mindful of getting as much information as you can about how systems currently work, and then getting a lot of information about how the systems could work in your reality or your dreams, and then crushing them together and sort of saying, here is what we have, now let's work together to get everybody on the same page.
One person was wondering, what efforts are individual police departments making to reach out and connect with their communities?
So we get a lot of calls, and we have tons of police chiefs who are coming to us and saying, okay, how can we sit down with our communities and really think about this work? And how can we be better or understand the needs that we have sort of either not seen or maybe ignored or maybe tackled in a way, that has been different than what we are seeing now. And so we work with our chiefs, and we say, you know, where to start? Who have you been talking to in your communities? What does your community look like? What events are you hosting? Sometimes they want to host virtual town halls, given the world that we are in now with COVID, and we sort of help them do that. But it's also a thing about making sure that you're not just bringing people to the table so that you can hear and not listen. I think that community has the power, and I think that we sort of encourage our chiefs to lean on the leaders of your community to help bridge those gaps. And so all we're doing is sort of being a phantom in the back, giving both sides the opportunity to learn more about the work that each other are doing. Because it's a lot easier to sort of have a neutral party bring both to the table. But at the end of the day, we want both entities to feel empowered to do this work with or without us.
Have you noticed that connecting the community with the police departments is effective in lowering or like bringing more equitable policing, or?
It depends on the community, right? Because every community is different and every department is different. I think that what people are trying to do, and I sort of have talked a lot about this with the community members that I work with and sort of the law enforcement departments that I work with, everyone wants to do what someone else is doing. Everybody is really in a space where they want to be change agents, but it takes a lot of work to be a change agent. And so everybody has been coming to us sort of saying, do you know who does this? Or has anyone done it before? And it's like, no, why don't you become the first to do it? Because it's not going to, what works in Seattle is not going to work in Minneapolis, and what works in Minneapolis is not going to work in Florida, and what works in Florida is not going to work in California. And California has north and south and different, so there are different ways of approaching it. And what I encourage my departments to do is really be a part of your community. If community members are saying the same thing that you're saying, that you don't want to police mental health, or that you don't want to police homelessness, or that you don't want to police, different areas of poverty, of places where poverty intersect with policing, that's communities don't want that either. So why are you guys not talking to each other? And then you're realizing when you do talk to each other, you both want the same things. Who is going to make that happen? That's when you bring your policymakers, because you guys are both wanting the same things.
One person asked that, they said, I've noticed that many people are in denial of the fact that there is systemic injustice in the police system, and that the police system often acts on pre-existing racial biases. How do you think we can combat / attempt to change this denial that many may have?
That's a good one. Many people have been pointing to sort of this notion of implicit bias training. So you hear that a lot, right? That everybody needs implicit bias training. If you think about that, that's like the DE&I for the rest of the world. Everybody needs DE&I training. And if you have that, you're going to be this racial justice warrior. I think what people are failing to realize is that we have to sit in the history of this country and sort of its racist policies. And if we're not doing that first and doing the work of unpacking our positions of power and our places of agency, then we're getting nowhere. Because if you're not understanding the history of your country and the role that systems have played in sort of oppressing particular groups of folks, this is where the disconnect is. You can't even get to the DE&I or the implicit bias if people haven't sat in the history and acknowledged sort of where our country started from, or where policing started from, which is from slave patrols. And so if the history of an organization or an entity is rooted in historical oppression, and we have not publicly acknowledged that, set with it, and moved forward. You can't train people on things that they don't know. You can't train people of how not to have implicit bias if a system that they're working in has not acknowledged that this system was rooted in slave patrols. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
One person asked, given the budget cuts across different police departments, do you see an increased role of private contractors, and what are the challenges with that?
Anything private to me is sort of, it gives me a little heartburn, because private doesn't always mean better. And private doesn't always mean equitable. And it doesn't always mean that people are going to have the same anti-racist, thinking or protocols or sort of frameworks that are necessary to move change forward. And so that's sort of where I am. I think if you are looking for that type of anti-racist system, policies, procedures, that can happen in any type of sector. People just have to be willing to do the work.
So do you think the problem of like police brutality and unequitability would go down, would go up with private contractors, or an increase in private contractors stay the same, or do you think it would change in any substantial way, or no?
Personally, I could see it going up. And I say that because there's no mechanism of accountability, and you're not being able to measure and evaluate. Currently, in the structures that we have right now, there are ways to measure and evaluate progress. The problem is that people are not doing it well, and they're not standardizing it, and they're not accounting for the right types of things to measure. So when you are joining the police academy, there are soft skills that are taught and there are hard skills that are taught. And so hard skills, you're thinking of how to shoot a gun, how to arrest a suspect, all of the physical training that you think of when you think about police departments. When you are thinking about hard skills, that would be your implicit bias training, sort of your ability to be empathetic, all of those things. Those are the first things that are cut when programs go, or those are the things where there's not an emphasis on building your soft skills. So if you decide to create a mechanism of accountability where we are measuring soft skills, then that will allow for people to track soft skills. So if you are saying implicit bias training, or this training, or that training, or moving people into being more empathetic, you would create policies, procedures, mechanisms, and trainings that would then be able to track soft skills. The same thing for hard skills. If you can do that in this system now, there wouldn't need to be private systems, because you could measure what is working and tweak it, and measure what isn't and tweak it. If you pull it all to private systems, you're starting at square one again. And many people they're not the same regulations for a private system. So we wouldn't need to say, oh, well, these were the things that weren't working before, can you measure them now? Because they may not even need to have those regulations in place. And so then by default, you could see things rising or problems rising because there's no mechanisms of accountability. What I can say, though, is that if you have the right people in place with sort of an evidence-based background and an anti-racist framework, there's a possibility that it could go in the opposite direction. I think really those are the two things that are important to think about, though, is that who is measuring, are they measuring, and what are they measuring,
So in our we had another webinar today, and we had a policeman come and talk, and he said that police are being blamed for all of the current societal ills. And one participant is wondering, what do you think about that statement?
So we have 5 audiences, right? And so I can see, so our 5 audiences, again, for CPE are our science community, our general community, our policymakers, our law enforcement agencies, and our donors. I think that I feel where our law enforcement brothers and sisters feel the burn. And so when I talk to them, I understand where they are at the crux of many signed up for a different job than what is currently showing up right now. I work with, my boss is a former chief. Many of my coworkers are former chiefs. That's what makes CPE unique, is that we have former law enforcement who they retire and they come to work for us. I don't think, and I'm very harsh when I do talk to my department chiefs, I'm like, it's the tough place to be right now in this world, but it's also a tough place to be Black. It's a tough place to be a person of color. It's a tough place to constantly see yourselves represented on camera being murdered. That's tough. And so whether or not you're thinking about what the laws are, what the regulations are, what the badge stands for, people are dying. And so it's tough for everybody. And when you sort of think about that and sort of pull away this notion of we're not blaming individual officers. We're not, and some people are, but for most of us, it's not about blaming individual officers. It's not about blaming this or that. It's about blaming a system that is failing its people. It is failing Black people. It is inequitable. It's failing us, and it's not a system that's going to work in the shape that it's in right now. And so if you are sort of at that job, you gotta take it. It's like, a teacher who gets a bad report because of, the current state of the budget for the classroom, and they're not able to meet those needs. It is the duty that you have to take on right now, and the responsibility that you have to take on, because your profession is just under fire. And so that's just the right of us as people to demand better, to hold folks accountable, and to critique. And I think that when I explain that to officers, they sort of understand that and they think about that. But then on the flip side, when I talk to community members, it's like, these people also have families. They have homes. They have things that they're coming to this. This is a job for them. This is something that they signed up for. They didn't sign up with the notion of this entity represents slave patrols and the history of this oppression. Many did not sign up for that. And so it sucks. But the fact is that until our entire country reconciles our racist past, we're going to be at impasses where people feel burdened by the badge in many different ways.
So in relation to that, what are your thoughts about defunding the police and that whole train of thought?
I think the term is very catchy. I mean, I think it's a term that everybody can sort of jump on, but I think it means different things for different people, right? For some people, it really does mean we're sick of these systems, cut them, And then for other folks, it means we want to divest, taking away from the budgets of police departments and investing into Black communities. CPE is all about investment in Black communities. We're here for it. What we want people to realize is that there has to be a plan to do that. There has to be. Because if you don't have a plan, what's going to happen is that people will try it whatever way we decide on. And then if it doesn't work, we run the risk of going back to the old systems. Mm-hmm. And then the old systems will have more legitimacy to then be even more unapologetically burdensome. And so that is what we're cautioning people to think about, is when you are saying defund, what do you mean? That's an approach. We want a plan. When you say you want justice, what does that mean? People need the evidence to be able to back your plan. And when your plan goes into place, it is more likely to be sustainable and progress and evolve and be able to innovate if you have the frameworks in place. And in order to do that, one of the things, unfortunately, that's very important is thinking about who does what in departments, what are the value adds, do we need to pull everything away at once? If not, what stays? Tinkering the systems while you are building up your mental health, your affordable housing, your other systems of social services and welfare. I think that's really important for people to realize.
One person was asking, so in relation to accountability in police, how responsible do you think police unions are in preventing police from being held accountable to the public? And what do you think can be done to increase civilian oversight over police?
I get this one a lot. So one of the things that I will say is that I am learning about police departments in real time as well. And police unions are one of those things that is very nebulous for a reason. It's very amorphous for a reason. And I think that people really should take time to understand the unions because they have a lot more control over things than the average community citizen would think. And if you know, they sort of control the policy. So if you're thinking about how policies are made, the unions help to, like all unions, you know, teachers unions, labor unions, all of those things, they're there to protect the interests of the folks who are working there. And I think with our society now, unions have become a stalemate in a lot of negotiations and places to be able to make things better. And it's sort of, you know, a blocker and a barrier. And if we can get into a place where we're thinking about police departments and their unions as a part of the community, we'll be able to better understand where our agency is and reimagining the systems at play and the accountability factors. But again, as I always say to community members and to everyone, you have to understand the departments as they work now and as they function, the unions as they work now and as they function, and then any other entity that is tied to, you know, policing accountability. Having all of that information will then allow you to work within your policies to change them.
So currently, as the unions operate now, do you think police unions are doing more harm than good, or what are your thoughts on the role they play?
I think they have a stronghold. I think that there is the potential for them to do better. And if they have a strong hold right now, and because the way the tides are turning or the way that sort of officers are showing up and being able to move outside of accountability, it's disheartening. And I just think that what can be done, I'm reading sort of in the chat now, what can be done to increase civilian oversight over police is banding together and demanding things like civilian oversight boards, working to have a task force that is specifically designed for oversight, figuring out where in your communities there are places for community members to sit on different public safety agency boards. The more oversight and the more plugged in you can be as a community member to those boards, the more access you have to the language and the contracts and the materials and the ability to vote on whether or not these policies are good or bad. And then that shrinks the power of things, because if you have 5 people who've joined and they say this is not right, that's 5 less percentages of power that people can have to move things forward. And so I think being really informed and educated about where you are in your community and how you can join those different task force and places where people are making those decisions, that's really important.
One person was wondering, so communities of color face generational poverty, and everywhere in the world, marginalized and poor communities face the brunt of police force. Given there's continued defunding of education, why not focus on education department, which may solve the root of the cause?
So for me, as a Black American, I always was raised with the idea that education is the way forward. The problem is that every system is so intertwined that that's not always the case. You know, I'm a graduate of Bowdoin College. I got a master's degree at the New School. I've lived and worked all over the world, doing, you know, generational work. So doing work in communities at many different levels of generation, many generational levels. What I can say here is that you can do all of these things. You know, everybody is now in a moment where they want to see what budgets look like. The first step is understanding those budgets in your community. If you don't like that there's not enough money going to education, you need a committee to be like, or a group of concerned citizens that says, we want the education budget to have this, 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 and this. And at the same time, the people who don't want police budgets to expand, they can be over there saying, okay, pull it from here because we don't need this, 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 and this. What you need is really everybody attacking all of the inequitable systems at once. And while they're doing that, the plan needs to be that this is how all of these systems will run together, collaboratively, and oppressively once we put them all together. So I don't think it's one or the other. I think this whole country is based on inequitable systems that are profiting off of the backs of Black and brown bodies. And what we need to do is be uplifting those Black and brown voices and their perspectives and their agencies to demand better. And when we do that, we need to have a plan of how we're going to do it, because we really only have, one shot.
So in terms of like budget reallocation from the police, what parts do you think, like what parts of the police system do you think have too much money, and what are they spending all this money on? And what do you think should be cut?
So that's a question that I am not going to answer in the way that I think most people are going to, because as I've stated many times throughout here, and I feel like I'm dancing around it, but it's not that at all, you guys. It's really just every community department is different. So we work with a really, really small agency right now, and their community, we're doing a whole big thing with their community. And they were like, well, our police department has all the money and they're taking all of these things and da, da, da. And we're at this town hall. And so we see the budget. So the mayor came on and did this big budget conversation, showed the budget. The budget showed that most of the money was going to public works and not policing. And it showed that there were supposed to be 93 police officers for all 30,000 of its citizens, but they were operating on a 20-person department. And then at max capacity, at an ideal rate, they would have 63 officers for 30,000 people, but they were operating on 20. And that's not to say that they need more or less. What it is to say is that the national conversation is that police departments are having these enormous budgets like the NYPD and the LAPD, but for the average community, the budgets are really split. And sometimes the budgets are more investing in public works than it actually is in the department. So the action step for everybody here is to think about your community. Go and look at the budget for your community, and that will tell you where all of the money is being spent. And it could totally turn out that it's really at the police department, but it could be other places. And so I want people to really be in their community budgets.
One person asked, which is sort of in line with this train of thought, is a lot of the focus right now is about either pulling money out or adding regulations to police departments. How far do you think these will go towards making a more equitable police department? And will these inequities really go away unless we change the mindset of people, which is a much longer term solution?
Yeah. So one of the things that I also have been talking to folks about is that people think that the only people who work in a police department are the cops that wear the uniforms outside. And for example, with the NYPD, if you pull many of the jobs away, those are single moms, single Black moms who are showing up every day to work in those agencies, whether they're secretaries, whether they're actually officers, whether they are, civilian staff working in those departments to help them run every day. 80,000 of those women will lose their jobs. And so those are Black moms that are head of households. And it's not to say that we should keep these organizations going, but when you pull money away, you have to be thoughtful about then what is what are the consequences of pulling that money away? So let's say you pull it away from that budget and 80,000 Black moms lose their jobs. That means their entire families are going to collapse in the middle of a COVID crisis where people are barely able to afford their rent. And so I just caution people around the rhetoric of let's pull, let's pull, let's pull. What I encourage people to do is get informed, get informed, get informed. When you're informed about how systems and processes and organizations work, you are better able to make equitable, solutions-oriented, evidence-based solves for those issues.
That makes sense. One person was saying, the officer we were talking to earlier today told us that several members of the police force came from a military service background. Do you think that these people have violence too ingrained in their mind to be safe/nonviolent police officers, or do you think they can become responsible police officers?
I think every individual is individual, right? I think what the problem becomes is that you need to make sure that you're having standardized anti-racist historical training for everybody, whether you're working in the department as an officer with a gun or the secretary. Same thing for every system in this country. The problem becomes many of the officers. I was talking to an officer, I'm working in a town on their task force, helping them to get things sorted as they reimagine public safety. And the officer was telling the community members were really upset because it seemed as if the officer, the chief of this department, wasn't being receptive to the reimagination task force. And so when I talked to the officer alone, the chief, he sort of walked me through his entire paramilitary background. And he's like, you know, I've served in these places, I've worked here, I've done this, and my entire job was community relations. It was just in an international context. And so I'm kind of insulted that people feel as though I'm not a community member and that I don't care about the community when that's been my life's work. And that when I no longer wanted to be of service to my community, to my country in that way, I became a service to my community. And I signed up for the police department hoping that I could continue the work just domestically. It hurts me to hear that. And so when I talk with him, I do understand that people assume that every officer is this militaristic person who is just ready to pull out a gun and shoot everybody. That's sort of just the rhetoric and the narratives and things that we hear. But what you don't hear are stories of individuals who are talking about those things and are very excited and have been given service their entire lives. What I encourage the chiefs to think about as well is that if your entire life has been sort of in the service of protecting people, what does that say about your language? You know, how do you see yourself? Because if you see yourself as a protector of people, you don't see yourself as a community member, because community members don't need protection in the way that you're thinking of protection. And you're thinking of being, you know, this valiant soldier in a way. And sometimes that's problematic when you're thinking about reimagining community, because you're essentially telling people that you know better than they know about how to handle their problems and their solutions. And they want you to be a member of the community who helps to enforce the laws. They don't need you to be a protector of the realm. And so some of that thinking has to happen, and the conversations have to keep going so that people can hear those in real time and sort of adjust themselves and how they show up to the work.
That makes sense. This is the last one that I see. Someone asked a broad question, but what do you think is the first thing Americans need to do to combat racial injustice? Is it change in societal norms / mindsets, voting, innovating, etc.? So.
Oh Lord, as a Black woman in America, ideally I would just say, you know, we need to start again. But as someone who knows that can take many shapes and forms, I think we need everything. I think we need people who are in the streets, because when you're in the streets protesting, people are listening. The media is there and the attention is there. We need people on social media constantly educating people, going beyond, you know, sort of the front-facing conversations and giving people resources, because many people want to learn, they don't know how to. And so that could be your role. We need people who are sort of showing up to work every day as a representation of their identities, because many of these identities are constantly under assault by the current systems and structures that we have. And so you can be a change agent in everything that you do, and it's going to take everyone sort of collectively doing that so that we can continue to push and push and push and push for the systems and the structures and the things that we want to see. I don't think it's really one size fits all, because this country wasn't designed in that way. It was designed as a one, you know, not fits all. It was a one. White men. And so anybody else outside of that is going to have to fight to reclaim it to be a one size fits all model. And I think you cannot have very closed-minded binary thinking that if I'm a protester, that's all that's going to change things. If I'm working in this profession, that's all that's going to happen. No, we need everybody everywhere sort of subverting systems. We need people of color as prosecutors, because you have the ability to decide whether or not people are going to be charged with crimes, and you can advocate because of your lived experiences and your connections to your communities. We need people to sort of be police officers if the structures stay the same or if they don't, because you are the difference between someone getting a ticket or not, because you may not see the world in a different and more multicultural way. We need teachers because the curriculum is not there to teach people the history of our country. And so if you're constantly being in a space where you can educate people on what's not in the books, you are changing minds. We need protesters. We need people who have money to bail people out of jail. We need bail funds. We need all of these people working together to just burst open the realm of possibility of a country that was built on the backs of Black and brown people.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. So that was, yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much for taking time to join us and for sharing what you have. And I want to thank all the participants for coming and joining. And yeah.
Of course. Anytime you guys need me, you can find us on CPE's website and things. And if you do go onto our website and sort of have inquiries, I'm sure Simi can sort of tell you how she found us, but we're always responsive, and anything that you need from us as you're thinking about the ways in which you can be change agents, CPE is really here to help you move the work forward. So thank you guys so much for your time.
Yes. Thank you all.